At this time, I'd like to convene the May 20th meeting of the ERIC PSAC. We'll call this meeting to order, and it's my pleasure to introduce Admiral Barnett. Admiral?
Thank you so much for the opportunity to address this is the second meeting of the ERIC Public Safety Advisory Committee. So whether you're participating in the room here or on the phone bridge, I really want to thank you for being here, being on the line, and for the work that you've done. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to make it to the first meeting. I didn't have a kidney stone and was not taking morphine at the time, but I may have been beating a weenie. I don't know. But at any rate, when you look around the room and when you look at the resumes of the folks we have on the phone, you think of the literally, and I'm not saying you guys are old, but the hundreds of years of experience and all of the expertise that you are bringing to bear on some, to me, of the most important questions that the Federal Communications Commission and really the country are facing right now. We rely on this. I mean, and here's the thing, it certainly is what we wanted when Eric was stood up and we said we have to have a Public Safety Advisory Committee, that kind of direct input, the ability to have conversations and to have powerful conversations among you to inform us. It may be things, you know, that are absolutely crucial to us. It may be things I don't want to hear, but I do want to hear all of it, and it's exactly what we look forward to. So thank you for this. I know that we have 4 very important reports today coming from the tasking that you received, the topics of interoperability, applications and user requirements, security and authentication, and network evolution. So over the past few months, I know that you have worked very hard on these things and strived diligently to get these documents ready. I look forward to hearing them. I'm not going to be able to be with you all today, but I'm going to be listening in and participating, at least my ears participating wherever I can. As the committee prepares to discuss and deliberate these recommendations, I want to thank you once again and particularly thank some of the leadership, Bill Schreier, Jackie Miller, Dennis Martinez, and Ken Budka for your leadership. I know that task was daunting, and Ken has already told me that there was a little bit of time at night, a little time on the weekend, so the FCC does not pay overtime. We apologize for that, but we do appreciate that expertise. And before concluding, I certainly want to thank your leaders, Chief Jeff Johnson, Chief Eddie Reyes, the Chair and Vice Chair. Certainly their time and service to the PSAC already has been remarkable, and I think it adds directly to the benefit that the FCC and the nation gets out of that. I look forward to their continued leadership, because it's certainly not over. There's more to be done as we work to ensure nationwide interoperable network, public safety broadband network for our first responders and emergency workers. So once again, thank you so much for the work, and I look forward to the results today. Thanks, sir.
Thank you, Admiral. And for the record, when the Admiral was talking about the hundreds of years of experience, he wasn't talking about you, Harlan. Yeah.
Okay, that's your first chance.
I'm only taking one. So, Admiral, thank you, and thank you to the staff for all the support you've given us. There's a lot of folks on the phone bridge and sitting around this table that cared a lot about this topic, and we appreciate the opportunity to have a voice. So thank you, Admiral. We know you have things to do that are demanding your attention, so we understand when you need to go, but thank you very much.
Not as interesting as this, but I might.
Thanks, Admiral. Chief Reyes.
Chief, thank you very much. Again, I just want to compliment the Chairman Jankowski, for hosting this most important meeting. Obviously, Admiral Barnett for hosting us here today. But I especially want to put in two plugs. First of all, for the Commission staff that has supported us tremendously during this effort. Jennifer Manor, Gene Filano, and Brian Hurley have just been it's been invaluable, the support that they've given us. This is a lot of work that I think is going to be demonstrated here when the committee and the working chairs give their report. And it certainly could not have been done without their effort, but it certainly could not have been done without the support that we got from the Commission. And from the highest level, from the chairman all the way down to the 3 attorneys that were dedicated to this project and this committee, our heartfelt appreciation has to be clearly expressed to the Admiral and also to the Chairman. So thank you, Admiral Barnett. I think a lot of the things that I wanted to say have